I'm Professor Tanya Katerí Hernández, and today I am the face of America. I grew up an Afro-Latina, Puerto Rican ancestry in New York City. I am mixed race, Black and Latina, and with that background, I have seen the ways in which regardless of what my own personal identity has been, the reaction to me has been based on what I look like. Right? And there have been attempts to limit my ability to succeed. Applying to colleges, I was told, no, some schools are not meant for you. Don't reach too high. Don't work beyond your lane. And it wasn't about sort of how I personally identified, it was about how people looked at me from the outside. So this made me very cognizant of the really very strong influence and the continuing legacy of racial discrimination, and something that I very much want to try to work towards providing greater insights about. And that's what all my writing is about, and that's what I try to teach in the classroom as well. My name is Tanya Hernandez, and I am a law professor, and I work at Fordham University School of Law. And I'm the author of a new book entitled Multiracials and Civil Rights, Mixed Race Stories of Discrimination. People often wonder, what can we do to end racism? And of course, that's a very complex situation. But the very first thing that we need to do, of course, on that path to eradicating racism is to acknowledge that we do still have the problem. One of the hugest battles in fighting discrimination are those who, although well-intentioned, want to feel that it's a problem of the past, and unfortunately it is not. I think one of the most important contributions that has been made recently is the study with social psychologists of something called implicit bias. And the reason why I think it's so promising is because implicit bias talks about the ways in which all of us, no matter what our racial background, have an exposure to cultural norms. That is to say, that we're all exposed to the same stereotypes, the same misinformation about one another. And what this does is, I think it helps to try to take off the table questions about feeling guilty, particularly for people who are white, for this fear of white fragility around questions of race, and reticence to talk about race, thinking that that will make you the racist, that you will be accused of that. When we put into the conversation this question about unconscious discrimination, unconscious bias, also known as implicit bias by social psychologists, I think what that does is it levels the playing field. It helps us to all understand that we're all in this together, and that we're all equally exposed to misinformation that we need to then become aware of in order to overcome. The study of racism has long been thought of as being just about those who are Black and those who are white. But of course, our world history has long been much more complex than just Black or white. And so I think it is useful, the emerging voices of people of all different backgrounds and ethnicities shedding light on their own histories of racial discrimination. At the same time, I think it would be misplaced to believe that the entire framework for thinking about racism that's been rooted in Black versus white discrimination is antiquated. That is to say, I think there actually still is a binary, even if while we look at many more ethnicities being implicated. So that is to say, while we can look at the histories of discrimination against those who are of Asian ancestry and Latino ancestry, etc., it's still within a framework in which the world expresses discrimination in binary white versus non-white terms. And that all the work that's been done at looking at discrimination from Black versus white is still very useful and illuminating for us. When I was doing the research about the ways in which people of mixed race ancestry are discriminated against, one of the things that I found really quite surprising were the number of cases that were filed by white parents and white grandparents of multiracial young people. And that was particularly in cases of housing discrimination. And what I saw there was that there would be, like for instance, white grandparents who would rent an apartment and think of their multiracial grandchildren as sort of not having a race, that they were just their beloved grandchildren who they wanted to shield from any kind of racial identification, because to them they weren't race, they were family, right? So all very well intentioned. But when it came to then encountering discrimination, these white grandparents had sort of an awakening. What they discovered was that when their landlords would sort of see pictures of their grandchildren, they were no longer just sort of beautiful little young grandchildren. They were now viewed as non-white. Often children with African ancestry in their mixed race heritage would be called by negative racial epithets, which I don't care to repeat, but I think you can immediately identify. And so, you know, what was sort of a takeaway for me with these stories that I was reading is that for these white grandparents and white parents as well, what they were learning, and I think needed to continue learning, is that no matter how much they love their children and grandchildren, regardless of race, that they had to sort of start preparing their loved ones for living in a raced world. Right? And that's not about predetermining what their racial ancestry identification should be, but about helping to make them understand that they would be perceived as non-white, and that sometimes that would come with negative reactions and connotations. So in order for their children not to be taken unawares. It is a harsh reality, but it's one that as parents and grandparents we need to prepare our children for, unfortunately.